Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In the previous verse, we learnt about how the first and second birth of the soul takes place. As usual, the link to the previous video as well as the book under study, the book The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, is linked in the description below. From this video onwards, we will be looking at how the Holy Quran seeks to raise a human being in degrees of consciousness. So let's get started.
اسمعوا صوت السماء جاء المسيح جاء المسيح.
As mentioned in the previous video, the Promised Messiah ﷺ explained that just as the soul is produced with the gradual development of the fetal framework within the womb, similarly, the second birth of the soul, or in other words, the birth of the spiritual self, takes place with the framework of human actions being completed. For an in-depth explanation on this, please do check out the previous video. Now, His Holiness explains an important analogy. He says that just as the fetus manifests signs of life after 4 months and 10 days of its conception, the laws of nature cause the spiritual birth of a person in a similar fashion. Observation would show that a human being spends a better part of his or her life in the pursuit of libertine pleasures. It is only after he or she approaches or passes the age of 40 that he or she starts to shed the vagaries of their youth. A person first spends his or her life as an infant for many years, then in acquiring an education to get a job, then by getting married or amassing wealth and honor through work, and does not fully realize the objective of his or her existence or life on this earth, and only starts to take this particular question seriously when one starts to become old and death is no longer a distant possibility. We can, however, take and derive an important lesson from this dilemma, and that is, if you were to realize that just as the soul is born from the gradual completion of the fetal framework, similar is the case with your spiritual birth, then you would also realize how critically important it is for us to utilize the time of our youth. Explaining the irony of one's age of youth, the Promised Messiah ﷺ states, "In this state, how can he ever believe in the subtleties of the hereafter? Instead, he mocks and derides religion and parades his own dry logic and sophistry. Of course, if he is good by nature, he may believe in God, but does so without full faith and sincerity, and that too is conditional upon his own success. If his desires are fulfilled, he turns to God. If not, he turns to Satan. In short, youth is a critical period of one's life, and without divine grace, one might well land in the pit of hell. The fact is that this part of one's life is the root of all evil. It is at this time that one contracts most physical ailments and some unmentionable diseases. The mistakes made in the callousness of youth often cause man to turn away from the true and immutable God. Thus, at this age, he fears God but little and is driven by carnal passion and dominated by his baser self. He pays little heed to the advice of others and suffers the consequences of this age for the remainder of his life." In a nutshell, though we are naturally more inclined to worldly pursuits during our youth, we can most definitely, however, prepare ourselves by endeavoring to perfect the framework of our actions to put us in a better position when we are older. People who work out to maintain a healthy lifestyle do exactly this. Same is the case for a person who works for an early retirement. So why shouldn't we do it for our own spirituality? This is where the Holy Quran comes in. It seeks to help man to reform his natural condition and bring him to a spiritual state. Explaining how God does this through the teachings of the Holy Quran, His Holiness states, He bestows on man, through His teachings, rules for the reform of his natural condition, and then gradually lifts him upwards and desires to raise him to the highest spiritual state. I realize that the principle of profound spiritual insight underlying the following divine scheme is that first, God desires to teach man the rules of social behavior like sitting, standing, eating, drinking, talking, etc., and thus to deliver him from a state of barbarism and distinguish him from the animals, and thus bestow upon him an elementary moral state which might be described as social culture. He then desires to regulate his elementary moral habits so that they should acquire the character of high moral qualities. Both these methods are part of the same process as they are related to the reform of man's natural condition. There is between them a difference of only a degree. The All-Wise One has so arranged the mortal system that man should be able to rise from a low to a high moral condition. After these stages comes the third stage of human progress, in which man endeavors to devote and commit his whole being for the pleasure of God. This is why the religion presented by the Holy Quran was named Islam. According to Islam, salvation is based upon one's individual relationship with God, not just ascribing to a particular belief system. Explaining this, the Promised Messiah ﷺ states, God the Glorious has said, Nay, whoever submits himself completely to Allah and is the doer of good shall have his reward with his Lord. No fear shall come upon such, neither shall they grieve. Salvation means that a person should commit himself wholly to God and should offer himself as a sacrifice in the cause of God, and should prove his sincerity not only through his motive but also through righteous conduct. He who so comports himself will have his recompense from God. Such people shall have no fear, nor shall they grieve. That brings us to the end of today's dars. In the next dars, we will take a deeper look into how the natural conditions transform into moral conditions and then into spiritual conditions. As mentioned before, I have linked the book in the description below as well as the previous video. Make sure to subscribe, like and share this video so that we can enable as many people as possible to benefit from the treasures left behind by the Promised Messiah ﷺ. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.